Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and this is my review of Killers, an Indonesian-Japanese co-production from 2014 that is most accurately described as a dark thriller-drama hybrid. Now, the production companies are a mix of Japanese and Indonesian investors, so this is a true co-production. Also, the creative aspects of the film are also a mix of these two countries. It was directed by the Mo brothers, who previously gave us the Indonesian horror film Macabre from 2009, but Killers was written and acted by contributors from both countries as well, and the film appears to be shot in both countries. So there's definitely an interesting production background for this one. Now, the plot goes something like this, okay? A Japanese serial killer and an Indonesian vigilante communicate on the internet while they murder their victims. Now, the Japanese man is a charismatic, wealthy Japanese executive based in Tokyo who has a hidden dark side. He uses different methods to brutally murder people, mostly young women, and he video records his deeds. Using a local internet cafe to leave no trace of his personal IP address, he uploads his murders to a video sharing website that quickly goes viral. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, an ambitious Jakarta-based journalist attempts to interview a corrupt politician about recent rumors surrounding domestic violence against his wife. The journalist's obsession to publicize this man's scandals previously has caused his marriage and career to completely fall apart. So soon this man will be confronted with a bloodlust that is aimed against those who did him wrong. So going into this, you might expect like a simplistic splatter film. I've heard some people, when they go into this, they're expecting just a really violent film that really doesn't have much else to offer. A film that relies on excessive violence to drive it forward. But that's really not the case here. On the contrary, this is a fairly ambitious character study that, takes its time to develop the two lead characters. And to this film's credit, I think it's successful at doing so. And that results in some dramatically intense moments throughout. This film has a lot more nuance and depth than you might expect. Now, the Indonesian protagonist has got some serious emotional problems that are realistic and relatable from the viewer's perspective because it primarily concerns his fractured relationship with his wife and his daughter. I don't remember if they were officially divorced or just separated, but there's definitely problems there, and that really drives his part of the film. You get the feel that this guy really didn't do anything wrong to get where he's at. He was maybe too ambitious at taking down this powerful dude that he was trying to expose. But his actions in the film itself are certainly questionable and, on moral grounds. So that kind of helps to create some multidimensionality. This guy isn't just a victim who just starts, going nuts. He certainly performs some questionable actions during this movie. Now, the development of the Japanese protagonist is taken from the opposite angle entirely. At the start of the film, he seems like a purely evil, just vicious person. But you eventually do see his vulnerabilities in, his broken outlook on life. The highlight scenes with this character are not necessarily his acts of violence against others, because he has a few really good exchanges of dialogue that show his, warped perspectives on life. He's capable of being charismatic and normal when interacting with people, usually to coerce them into coming back to his place so he can murder them. But he also has an interest in certain people, and he gives them advice and recommendations that are pretty interesting to say the least, especially when he tries to help them solve their everyday problems. So that there's definitely some multidimensionality there too, because it's almost like his persona is detached from reality to a certain extent. I found that to be pretty interesting. Now, Killers definitely deserves credit for pulling off that level of character development and making things interesting outside of the murder scenes themselves. But with regard to those murder scenes, they are fairly graphic and bloody. But I personally think that these directors' previous film, Macabre, was more gruesome and nasty than Killers is. So if you sat through and enjoyed Macabre, you'll have no problem sitting through this one. One reason for this, I think, is that there's very minimal torture in Killers. I think the opening scene is probably the longest sequence of violence that you'll see in the film. I could be remembering it wrong, but there's really not a whole lot of torture scenes that are like dragged out and extended in this. So the victims are dispatched of fairly quickly. It is disturbing, it's portrayed in a disturbing manner, but you don't have to watch them like get their eyeballs carved out or like, their fingers cut off or anything like that. So the violence that's depicted in Killers is edgy, but it's certainly not exceptional or historic in its brutality. So don't go in expecting that if you're like a hardcore horror fan or thriller fan. Another interesting thing I noticed is that there is a mix of likable and unlikable victims that are chosen. So at times, you fear what these killers will do to the likable people. But other times, you kind of wait in bloodlust anticipation to see what they do to the unlikable ones. You know what I mean? And that helps to create, again, relatable scenarios that make the viewer think about how far they would be willing to go in these situations, if at all. So again, we do have some nuance here that provokes a bit of thought. Now, before we get to my primary criticism of this movie, I have to mention that both Kazuki Kitamura and Oka Antara give really good performances in this. Kazuki has been acting for 20 years, and it's kind of surprising because he still looks young, but I just rewatched a few of Takashi Miike's films from the 1990s. He was in some of Miike's films in the mid-90s. He's been around so long. But you would be surprised to know that he has not had that many leading performances throughout his career in theatrical films, despite having over 100 acting credits on IMDb, many of those being TV roles. This guy needs to be used more. He's a talented dude. I always enjoy seeing him appear in movies. In fact, my first exposure to this guy was in Ryohei Kitamura's film Azumi from 2003, and I immediately became a fan of him because he was really good in that too. He has a certain, magnetic screen presence about him that I can't describe. But I would say that Killers is probably the best performance of his career from what I've seen so far. He's good in this. Now, I've seen Oka Antara in a small handful of films, but the first time I actually noticed him was in The Raid 2, when he just took control and kicked some serious butt during that car chase sequence. So I came into Killers, which I saw after The Raid 2, expecting something worthwhile from him, and he did not disappoint. He's especially good at portraying someone who is fragile and almost out of control emotionally. You know what I mean? And that certainly comes through here. But with all of that said, I do have one fairly large problem with this movie. Some of the thriller aspects themselves feel artificial and or contrived. For example, there's a gunfight inside of a car at one point where almost all of the bullets miss their targets despite a close range. And I understand what the filmmakers were going for. They're going for like a scrappy, emotionally disrupting kind of violence here. But it still felt somewhat ridiculous to me. I would have preferred fewer gunshots in the scene, or maybe have it constructed differently. Another example involves two cops who failed to spot a crime that is occurring right outside their line of sight. So the camera is positioned where you see the cops and the crime happening in the same frame, and the cops don't notice this crime happening. Not a problem per se, but the crime goes on for 20 seconds, So it's kind of stretching credibility there. You know what I'm saying? I would have preferred a shorter event. And another example that I want to bring up, there's an escape sequence later that's just, it's kind of absurd given the number of people involved and how it plays out. So you need to go into this understanding that some of the thriller aspects do stretch credibility and realism. You know what I mean? So if you're one of those people who needs a film to be realistic all the way through when you're dealing with this type of thing, that might annoy you. But, that's really the only problem I could think of when discussing this film. So I strongly recommend it. Killers is a very interesting flick. In fact, more interesting than I would expect going into it. And the most interesting aspects are scenes that are outside of where violence is shown. So that's good. And fortunately, it is widely available on DVD and Blu-ray. So be sure to check it out if it sounds interesting to you. And as always, I will see you next time.